next item on the agenda is again one of those topics we've been, I guess, nibbling around for a while, and that's really where do we go from here in terms of selecting the new executive director of the CRA. As commissioners, you may recall, I have put forth the idea that we separate from the RMA contract the executive director position, make the CRA executive director an employee of the city. That's just a proposal, and I don't think we have come together as a body to discuss that concept. So this is the time in which I'd like to hear your thoughts, where you would like to go, whether you agree, don't agree with that particular proposal, and that'll give staff some direction as to how we move ahead with the selection of the new executive director, whether that continues to be an employee of RMA, in which case there is a path we would go down, but if it is going to be bifurcated from the RMA contract, then there's a different path we would go down. But I just wanted to put that on the table for discussion and get your thoughts. So I think before we move further, let's hear an update on the CRA management structure currently. Is RMA going to present, Kim? Okay, please.
Yes, if I can just make a footnote. Sure. At the last work session where this topic was discussed, some of the commissioners wanted to take a look across the state to see if there were a similar model that you're recommending, Mayor, in place. And RMA has done that research, so we're asking them to kind of do that update.
Sorry.
Really? We got to wait for that?
Still trying. Sorry. I don't know what she's trying to do. Sorry.
While Allison is getting her presentation together, I just want to remind the commissioners, at least in my thinking, why I was proposing a separation, was to have a employee of the city who would be the face of the CRA, but also someone whose loyalties would not be divided between RMA, their employer, and the city or the city CRA, but they would, as an employee of the city or employee of the CRA directly, their alliances would be limited to the CRA, and I wanted to avoid any appearance of divided loyalties. If you go through the RMA contract, there are certain incentives and certain decisions that have fiscal ramifications for RMA versus the city, and so that's one reason why I wanted to have that position taken out of the RMA contract.
Mayor, if you'd like, I can give you a overview
Sure.
of the context, maybe of the decision points that you'll be going through, and then what Ms. Justice did, and what she just provided to you was some examples of other CRAs and how they have made those decisions and the status that they're in. But to put it in a context, it may help as you go through this process.
That's fine. Just for the record, identify yourself.
Yes, Kim Briesemeister. I am a principal with RMA, and your contracted firm managing both CRAs. The state of Florida has just over 200 CRAs, so there is not a great deal of depth in terms of types of examples that you can point to that you're going to see a pattern. Because there's so few of them, almost every CRA in the state of Florida functions differently. But there are a few things that are consistent with all of them as to how they are successful or those that have maybe not been quite as successful. And it really boils down to three things. One of them, and it starts with you all as the elected officials, because you formed the district to begin with, and then you had staff where you drafted a plan. And that plan is the guideline that forms what the CRA legally can and cannot do. So you're already starting through Chapter 163, which is your legal entity. You're starting with a set of rules of what you can and can't do. The next is your size. You happen to have in West Palm 2 districts. You can legally only have 1 agency, but you can have many districts. You have 2 of them. And the size of those districts dictates a lot of what happens, because depending on how big they are and depending on what's happening in them, the ultimate staff you need to implement activities changes. The third is the amount of TIF that you have. This CRA, in particular your downtown CRA, is one of the largest CRAs in the state of Florida. You are one of the most powerful in terms of having the most ability to use Chapter 163 at your disposal. And that's because of the year you were formed. In the 80s, CRAs were formed in 1969. Miami Beach was one of the first CRAs to get litigation that started to define what CRAs could and couldn't do. But you were formed in the 80s, which was relatively early on. CRAs that were formed before 2002 could live for a total of 60 years. Your initial term was 30, and if you chose to extend your agency, you could go a second 30. That's important because after 2002, only CRAs could operate for a maximum of 40 years. One of the most powerful tools you have is bonding ability, and you have the ability to have independent rated bonds, meaning that if you issue debt as a CRA, it doesn't count towards or against your general fund obligations. So you have a very powerful tool in the agency, and because of your age and your size, and because of the implementation that you've done, you've got a very, very strong foundation for future growth. And just to put it in perspective, there are 2 CRAs that were formed about the same time that yours were. I won't name the cities, but just for perspective, your TIF in your 1 district is well over $30 million. Their CRAs have a total of $8 million and $11 million, and they are major cities. So all of that difference has to do with the plan, the elected body and the direction they gave, and the implementation. So really what you're about to do now is you're talking about the team and the director and where that director position can reside. And what Allison has given you is some examples of other CRAs, many of these, if not most of them, through my business partner, Chris Brown, and my 30 years in this business, we've been involved in these one way or another, most of them. And the only preface I can say as you go through this discussion is there is no perfect answer. It really has to do with what's right for you and your CRA and the technical team that you have in place in its entirety. Because the CRAs that didn't have the success and enjoy the success that you have, at times they did have in-house directors, and at times they had contracted directors. So as long as the entire CRA board is setting the right direction, as long as your technical team in its entirety is capable and able to implement what you set, how you structure it is going to be largely up to you and how much control and desire you have to involve yourself. The only caveat to these, and I can touch on them, that changed a little bit, is really since 1999 or the beginning of the 2000s, there's been somewhat of an attack on CRAs in general in Tallahassee. And that was because after 20, 30 years of functioning, counties started to realize that a portion of their monies were going to city CRA districts, and there was a tussle over really who should control that money. Broward County has always been on the forefront of the more aggressive side of trying to limit or eliminate CRAs. And in the Pompano Beach example, that was one where our firm actually was contracted in 2009, and they had really struggled for about 20 years to get things going. We were able in 10 years to get them functioning. They are now enjoying a tremendous amount of success, but because of litigation with the county, that CRA was reduced down to a TIF-only, city TIF-only district. So they went from having 21 employees working on that city. Now they're down to 4 in-house people. So it isn't about the in-house versus contracted. It's really about the collective structure that I just talked about in terms of having the board your technical team, and your plans all lined up. That will give you the success and continue the success that you've had. We are your contracted firm since 2014. We are here and have been here to help you get where you need to go. It makes absolutely no difference to us which direction you go today. We will help you one way or another, make sure that, again, collectively your team is in place to get you the results that you direct us from an implementation standpoint. Another thing in the contract that exists today, it didn't really come out the last time when you first had your presentation. The contract does not give us total authority to choose a director and keep that director independent of you. You have the authority to tell us we like that person, or we don't even like particular staff members. And that contract obviously can be amended either way, to include or not include positions and or the ability to add or delete them as your programs and projects change. So like I said, to summarize, we're here to help you in whatever capacity. I think you should be very proud of what this CRA has accomplished, because it is recognized in the state as one of the most successful ones. And you have done a good job at keeping it that way through highs and lows of both market conditions, economic changes, political changes, et cetera. So we are here to help you in any way that you would like us to going further. Thank you.
Allison, do you have a separate presentation you'd like to make, or? Okay, all right. Board members, commissioners, I'd like to hear your thoughts on whether you want to keep the executive director as part of the RMA contract, or whether you are open to having that position be a city employee. My thinking is the power to hire and fire would be a board decision. I'm not looking to have someone report to me as the mayor. I see this as a position that would report to the CRA board in totality. And so I'm happy to hear your thoughts, ideas, whether you want to move forward with that or just maintain the status quo. Commissioner Neary.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for your presentation. So my question is really around the process. So we've heard and we understand it in the contract as it exists today, that we as a board have the authority to make a decision around ultimately who is the director. I don't think in the time that I have been on the commission, we as a board have, I know we haven't, we've not changed that philosophy. However, that decision was made, and it was made at the administration level. So my question really becomes around the process. Mayor, you just mentioned that it would be your desire, not to put words in your mouth, that this would be a position that was hired ultimately by the board. What I would want to know is, because as I look at the org chart, it does appear to be a position that would report directly to the mayor. So my questions really are, what would be the process if this position became a city position? What does that look like exactly in terms of hiring that position, in terms of ultimately changing? Because it is my opinion that ultimately the board, the CRA board, should absolutely continue to have the authority to make those decisions. I would strongly recommend that we do not change that in any way. Again, in terms of whether it's RMA or the city, I could go either way. It really is a process question, and maybe we don't have the answer to that now, or maybe we do.
Well, and under the status quo, and Doug is representing the city attorney's office. As I understand it, the RMA contract is with the city.
Yes.
And so I, as the CEO of the city, can weigh in on any amendments or adjustments to that contract. And so it was in that capacity that I expressed a need for a change in the previous executive director. Now, actually, what I'm proposing is going to minimize my ability as mayor to make that change. Because, as I said before, if the position comes in-house, and I don't know what language we have to put in place, but I'm looking to have that position, hiring and firing, be done as a CRA board decision. And so I'm actually proposing a limitation, I guess, if you will, on my powers. And so I know HR is here to talk about the process, I guess, for identifying and hiring a new executive director if it was a city employee. I don't know if that's the process you're talking about, or give me some clarification as to your question.
Yeah, I think specifically, I think I have a pretty firm understanding of what that looks like under an existing RMA contract. The question I have is if that position were to come into the city, much like chief of police, chief of fire, whereas not the board, but the commission ratifies that, which is a lot different. The question I have is, if this position were to come in as a city position, the board, not the commission, the board would ultimately vote on the decision, both in terms of how that recruitment looks, interviewing, very similar to the chief internal auditor, although I know that that's different because that is specifically the commission, but similar in terms of how that position is brought on board and then ultimately deleted is not the best term, changed if needed. Is that clear in terms of the question? So it's the process.
Okay. So let's talk then, Mr. Rodriguez, if you want to talk about the process for hiring, identifying applicants and hiring a new executive director.
Good morning, Mayor, Commissioners. Jose Luis Rodriguez, Chief Human Resources Officer. As the Mayor and Commissioner Nearing were discussing, the process by how you would recruit the position and how you would manage the position would be a decision of you all sitting as a CRA board and then a city commission. So you would give us direction you would give HR direction as to how you want to recruit the position. We have some suggestions we can give you as to where you can post a position and how the interview process will take place and the selection. And the same thing with making changes to that position in the future. That would be something that you all would decide as a CRA board and as a city commission, and then provide direction as to how that position, should it be needed to be fired or changed in the future, would occur. And I did put up here, just to facilitate the discussion of the differences between an in-house and a contract position, I gave you a handout, but I also put it up here as to some of the key differences between a CRA director as an in-house FTE position and as a contract position. The three main differences would be the direct accountability. If it was an in-house position, you wouldn't be managing a contract that manages the executive director. You would be managing the executive director directly, similar to how you do the internal auditor. You manage that position directly. That position reports to the CRA board and gets hired and fired by the CRA board. A second key distinction, I'm only going to cover three and then open it up for whatever points you want to speak to specifically, would be that the executive director as a city FTE would be helping to manage and provide oversight of the contract, as opposed to that oversight occurring with someone other than the executive director, because obviously the executive director currently is part of RMA, so they're not going to, police their own contract. And the third position would be a community stakeholder type of impact, where oftentimes when you're trying to build consensus with the community and with local stakeholder groups, they sometimes tend to view contractors as, well, you're not really a city employee, so you're not really empowered to make a decision, you're not really empowered to speak for the city. And having an executive director that reports directly to the CRA board as a city employee would help to alleviate that concern, because they have a city FTE that reports directly to the board, that is with them at community forums, speaking and presenting the positions of the CRA board. Those are the three main differences and contrast between them.
Did that address your at least part of your question, or you?
And if I could just ask one more,
Absolutely.
and then I'll stop for my colleagues. So in other words, if we were part of this process, the board was a part of this process, every board member would have a weighted, same weighted amount of power, if you will, in terms of making that determination. So if we had a candidate before us, we would vote very much in the way that we do on contracts. We would vote, let me back up. If we had 2 or 3 candidates in front of us, we would vote on those candidates. And as a board member, I'd be 1/6 of a vote is ultimately what it is. That would be the process.
If that's what the CRA develops as how that position is going to be structured. Because right now, that position is not structured. It's for you all to make that decision collectively. But yes, that would theoretically be the way that it would work.
And I think that, at least with respect to the identification and hiring, the process would be where we'd publish this, probably statewide, Florida, the position, get applications in, probably have internal staff go through those applications and wean them down to the top 5, 3, or whatever. And then those particular candidates would go around, interview with each of you individually to avoid any sunshine law problems. And in an open meeting, we would have a process whereby we would choose from the top 3 or 5 or whatever those were. And that's kind of how that would play out in terms of the hiring. Enter to a contract between that individual and the CRA board, which would spell out, duties, et cetera.
And we did also have some, in case you decide to go in the direction of having an FTE that's recruited, we did have some suggestions based on our prior experience in HR as to where some of the organizations, in addition to the City of West Palm Beach website, you can post a position to try to get the most qualified candidates in those areas. So this is some of the suggestion that we would have as a way you can post it both internally and the city's website, but also externally with outside organizations to maximize the reach, and also because these are Florida organizations and we're requiring Florida law experience usually for these types of positions, that's why we have it structured the way we have it as a proposal of what you can consider.
And was there a draft of the job description that was circulated to the board members? Did they get a chance to weigh in on the job description?
That was actually included in the packet when you had the first discussion.
Okay,
We did
all
not
right.
include it here, but we certainly can provide it. But if I could.
Sure.
I think it has been intimated, but the key thing here in terms of the current structure, is the fact that the CRA entered into an interlocal agreement with the city in terms of the management, of the contract. So therein lies the authority or the discretion, for the director relationship directly with the mayor. As you all are discussing this, if you're going to go in a different direction, then I think legal need to advise. I don't think that you need to then have that interlocal agreement between the CRA and the city, if you're going to go in a different direction where this is going to be an in-house executive director position. It seems to me that we have a different legal structure in place, and I'll let legal weigh in on that. But then in terms of the recruitment, how you want that process to look, that's what we're looking for direction. I think the mayor just articulated, and we certainly can proceed along that line. There are a number of options once you get the applications in on how you want to do the interview process, but that's the kind of discussion and direction we're looking to get today, so that if you all come to a consensus, we can move forward or not. That depends on this body.
Commissioner Schoaf.
Thank you, Mayor. I think the 2 things for me here today revolve around accountability and control. And that is for this commission, this administration, and commissions and administrations to come, because this decision that we're considering excuse me, affects that ability going forward. I think all along I've echoed some of those concerns about the controls And I think some context is warranted as well, because when we started into this process, we had a different CRA director. We have an interim CRA director currently. And I will speak only for myself that I have felt a significant shift in a positive direction in the way that the CRA has been perceived, particularly in my district and amongst CRA advisory board members, et cetera. I want to make sure that the authority of the CRA board remains intact, both in communications and in decision-making, but also make sure that we are moving forward as a CRA board and as a CRA in a city. Some of the concern I have about this process at this particular point in time is that we are coming to the end of an economic cycle. We have several CRA, very, very important CRA projects that need to move forward. We're looking at a process at this moment in time that's going to be 3 months, 4 months, 6 months. I don't know the timeline, and I'm sure it just depends on the applicants, et cetera. And I guess maybe I put forward an alternative path out there that, while I'm not opposed to considering this decision, is this something that we need to make a decision on now? Can we take a path forward of having RMA appoint a CRA director at the advisement of the CRA advisory board and revisit this to not miss out on getting projects pushed forward and completed? So I guess that's the idea that I would put out for discussion. Again, I think there are some distinct benefits that administration has put out for bringing the position in-house, in that we as a city have a more congruent process and have a bit more control of that position. But I guess as I look at the whole context of what we're considering, I look at the timeline and the place where we are today.
Okay, I hear you. Another advantage, and this has been alluded to, is having a person, individual who will be responsible for administering the RMA contract. Right now, that person really doesn't exist. I guess it's a city function, since there's the interlocal agreement between the CRA and the city. The city is the party that has entered into the contract. So, we could have a city staff member, and I think typically it's probably been the city administrator who was assigned that task of administering that contract on a day-to-day basis. The question is whether it would be more appropriate, more efficient to have someone who is in the weeds, if you will, day in and day out as the CRA executive director, who really has their finger on the pulse of the contract and the performance of the contract by RMA. So I throw that out there as well as an advantage of having an in-house executive director. So,
I have a question.
yes, Madam President.
Thank you. I have two questions. One, as it relates to HR, I know that in the previous work session that we had talked about some maybe intricacies or details of if this CRA executive director became a staff person, would they be covered by city HR regulations, benefits, all of that? Did we determine that?
Yes, typically they would be treated as no different than any other city employee in terms of benefits, procedures that they have to adhere by, their compensation package. The only difference would be that their reporting structure would not be to a traditional department director. It would be to whoever the board assigns.
Okay. And then I have a question about if we were to take this out in-house, out of the contract, I understand that the CRA involves a lot of details and regulations and policies that are very complex, and that was part of the benefit of having it contracted, is that you all deal with this. This is your specialty. So if we moved this in-house, or maybe you could even describe how you work with other municipalities when they have the executive director or staff person in-house to help make sure that that person has the knowledge and the wherewithal to make sure we're not making decisions outside of legal policies.
Thank you, Commissioner. It's a good point, because some of the CRAs that do get either sideways with the statute or end up having expenditures made that were inappropriate, it emanates from not having that technical knowledge in-house, and that's how those things happen. You have a couple choices, and if I could, I just wanted to ask if the attorneys would check. I can't find it in this contract right now, but in our previous contract, because this was amended, the city administrator is the contract administrator. And we are supposed to be going to them, and they are supposed to be administering and making sure that our checks and balances are with them. But that obviously, if it's going to change, we have to amend our contract anyway. But it isn't that there is no identified oversight for the contract. Back to the technical skills. You have two sets that you're truly looking for. You're looking for the very deep knowledge having to do with Chapter 163 and the expenditures and the ability to use that statute to your utmost, highest and best use. So that when you're interviewing, you might have it checked off because somebody says they were a CRA director for a while or they carried a position. I would really delve down in, and again, we'd be glad to help you with that. We would do it whether we provide that position or we help you find someone. They have to have a very, very deep bench of knowledge with that statute. The second is a little more difficult to measure. That is the part that has to do with take your real estate developments. You're not going to find that in your typical resume. You're not going to find it necessarily from somebody that's been a CRA director. Hence, that's why I gave that long upfront description of the technical talent from a team perspective. If your director has or doesn't have that ability to negotiate, let's say, large real estate developments, which that's the business that you're in, then you don't necessarily want to wait until you find a director that does, as long as you have someone else on the team, us or someone else, that does have that. And that can, without belaboring this, that can hold true for a lot of the initiatives within the agency. It could be marketing and business attraction, economic development, isn't necessarily something you're going to find up there. So my suggestion is we would need to make sure that your executive director's skill set is very, very clearly understood, and whatever they don't have, it's backfilled by someone or a firm, and then you'll be fine.
Yes.
Thank you. I have a question for Commissioner Schoaf to kind of talk a little bit about what you're suggesting. So are you suggesting maybe we don't decide whether it's in-house or contracted right now, or and kind of carry on for a few months, I don't know, 6 months till we see some of these projects come to fruition with the structure that we have now as an interim executive director? Or are you suggesting, hey, maybe we just move forward as is, yet finalize and make someone a permanent executive director with the contract, knowing that in 6 months we might revisit this again when some projects are, further along?
Sure, Mayor, if I may.
Yes.
I think that in context, initially when we started this, I was leaning towards making sure that we had those controls, and it seemed like the path to get there was to have an in-house position in the current director that we had. Since then, we kind of have this interim opportunity where now it's not clear to me if some of the tensions that I know I personally felt representing were part of a style of a director, or if they were part of the structure of the position. And so I guess the suggestion that I put out there is, because of economic circumstances, I would be in favor of seeing if it is a style issue and moving forward with the current contract that we have and revisiting this in 6 months and seeing how we all feel. While I don't like to hold the CRA in limbo, and I certainly respectfully see why administration would bring this forward, I think that we may miss opportunities. We may miss opportunities to move key projects, and I will admit very selfishly, key projects within my district that I see that could possibly stall because of changes, and no disrespect to RMA and how they're moving forward. I know it's all hands on deck at RMA. It's just the nature of having those changes amongst the organizations. And so I put that out to you as my fellow commissioners and as mayor for the decision of the CRA board to consider that there may be a period of time where we're put in this unique situation now where we have the ability to maintain the current structure that we have, but try it with different style of leadership and see how that goes. And if we still feel like we're in the same position to make this decision at that point.
Okay, my only response would be, I don't see us stalling. RMA is on board. We have an interim in place, and I think that we are continuing to make progress on the various projects that are out there. So I don't see us, kind of having to stop and start all over again. I think that we can walk and chew gum. We can undergo a process where we can identify if that's the druthers of the board, we can identify a good candidate while we're continuing to keep our eye on the ball when it comes to these various projects because of the contract that we have in RMA, and they know what their job is in terms of how we move forward. So I don't see that as being the reason for not moving forward with the suggested structure. You may have other reasons. Commissioner Peduzzi.
Thank you, Mayor. I think there's probably some benefit to maintaining some stability and continuity at this point, and I'm not sure if this is where Commissioner Schoaf was thinking, was that, I would assume that our interim director may be a candidate for this position, and we have a unique opportunity right now to give that some time potentially. It's kind of like a long job interview. She's already in the position. It sounds like there's positive things happening and a lot of big projects that are occurring. And so there may be some benefit of giving it a little time just to, see how things work out, in the near future anyway. I wouldn't necessarily have an objection to bringing the position in-house if things are the way you've suggested, Mayor, and my colleagues have suggested. I think it might be an expeditious way of us bringing in, or us having more involvement in the selection process, obviously, going forward, and maintaining, the authority that I think that we have and should continue to have as an independent board.
Commissioner.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I would be in support of bringing the position in-house from the standpoint of both this current board and the future boards. I think it really does elevate both influence and, we are in the trenches as commissioners and board members anyway, and to have a better say in who and what that personality looks like, I think is very intriguing to me, both selfishly and I think for future board members. The other thing I would say to your point, Commissioner Schoaf, and I don't necessarily disagree with it, but I would recommend that we just put a stake in the sand, because the reality is, even under an RMA contract, we as a board would not have as much power, but we still would have the flexibility to say, hey, this personality isn't the right personality. So I'm fearful about continuing to kind of kick these projects down the road when we need to just make a decision on them, and we still have the opportunity. So I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying if we are in fact going to, as a board commission, make that decision, we still have flexibility in 6 months to say, hey, it's not working out. Either way, although I'll just go back to having that position in-house, as it's been described both by the mayor and as I understand it from HR, I think gives this board quite a bit of authority that we don't currently have. And I think there's something to be said about that. So that's my thoughts.
Commissioner Schoaf.
Thank you. You know, and I guess the reason for me putting out that idea was to try to get an appetite for this board. Again, I'm not opposed to bringing this position in-house, and if it's the will of this board to proceed with this today, to your point, Commissioner Neering, there's nothing set in stone. You know, any decisions made by this board would be now or in 6 months. So I guess, again, the thing that I stress are accountability and control. As long as the accountability and control of this position remains with the board as an even vote amongst board members, I'm in favor of taking a look at bringing it in and just making sure that information is memorialized in writing, that the specific duties of this board are to interview, hire, terminate, et cetera. And so as long as we are making sure, because I know we've had several communications discussions here, and I think it's important for the people who occupy these seats well beyond us to not have a different interpretation of what that means. And so, you know, if we want to move forward today and say, let's put something in writing so that we can all review, I would support that decision.
Madam President.
Thank you, Mayor. And I appreciate having this robust discussion here. I think that the reason why we're here today is because at our last commission work session on this, that we talked about the desire of this board to look at bringing it in-house. But I also am concerned in making sure that we don't stall on any projects, but it's my understanding from talking with Ms. Justice that things are still moving forward. Maybe you don't have to give us an update on the projects right now, but you could tell us what are our next steps for making sure that we're staying on top of all our projects as we move forward and adjusting our contract with you all, if that is the case.
Yes, and that's another good point. Regardless, we have to amend our contract because the contract as written clearly has to change. You have a few options, and today was going to be very telling for us as to which way we would have to go to keep things going. We are down, obviously, one full-time position, so that work got transitioned partially over to Chris and I. Partially, Allison assumed a great deal more just hours and work, and then the rest of the staff consumed more time as well. That's probably not sustainable long-term. So depending on how long you want to take to transition, we have a couple options. One is Allison is your acting interim director. She's trained, she's qualified, she's very skilled, and I have total confidence that she will continue to keep the wheels on as we roll forward. Again, you have Chris and I here to assist, but if it's going to be an extended period of time, and I would say more than 90 days, my suggestion, so she does have a chance of being successful, is I would try to backfill the role that she was in and have an additional, at least, set of man-hours coming into the contract to give her some more ability to function effectively instead of being there by herself. That's already in the contract now, as far as having a director and a deputy. Right now, like I said, you're getting a morphed version of those two positions. So if whatever direction you're going to go, if it's going to be extended, I would go back either to the mayor or to our contract administrator and the attorneys and ask what parameters we have to try to provide you with those man-hours that we're supposed to be providing. And I think that is an interim solution that will work well. I don't think that things are going to necessarily stall, but I think obviously the sooner that there's full stability, the better.
I'd just like some clear direction. I think we can move ahead either direction in which the board decide. My preferences are clear, but I'd like to, get a vote up or vote down so we have an idea of which direction to head.
I can start. I think I'd be supportive of bringing the position in-house.
Okay, is there a consensus? We're not taking a formal vote, it's not a public meeting, but just a consensus, and we can then advise staff, yeah.
I would be in favor of that as well, but I'd also like to be kept apprised of what is the next steps with the contract and backfilling and how that's going to be looking, because we all want to make sure that these projects carry on.
Absolutely. Commissioner?
I'm in favor of moving forward.
Okay.
I'm in favor as well.
All right, and we will address the concerns that I've heard here of making sure there's something in writing to support the fact that this will be a position approved by the board, hiring and firing, and the process outlined as articulated by the head of HR. If you all have any other questions in the interim, please feel free to direct them to the city administrator. But having heard the consensus, we will now begin the process of advertising for the position. I think that gives you some direction, RMA, and we will act apace. I would suggest Kim and Allison maybe sitting down with the individual commissioners and maybe giving them a briefing on where we are in various projects of interest, so they could kind of get an idea of where we're going and the progress we're making. Okay?
I have a question, Mayor.
Yes, Madam President.
Thank you. To Commissioner Schoaf's point about memorializing these steps, will the board be voting on bringing this in-house, and will we see those steps outlined?
Well, I think you will be voting on an amendment to the RMA contract. And I don't know if we want to do that in one step or two steps. We can certainly bring back an amendment, or we can adopt a resolution, if you will. Maybe that's the way to do it. And I'm looking at my lawyer and my city administrator. Maybe we could adopt a resolution memorializing what we discussed here about bringing the executive director in-house as a formal resolution of the board of the CRA, and whatever other language we need to confirm that this new position will be accountable to the board as a whole, et cetera, et cetera. Would that be appropriate?
I think so.
Yeah, just so there is something in writing that we're voting on.
Yes, Mayor, Doug Yergin.
Okay.
Deputy City Attorney on behalf of Ms. Rothenberg. I would suggest certainly that we have the opportunity to go back. I think we need to look at the interlocal agreement between the CRA and the city. Take a look, obviously, at what we'd have to do with the contract between the city then and the RMA. Obviously, all can be done.
Okay.
We certainly want to make sure that the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted as related to that.
Okay.
And I would agree with that. I think administratively, one of the other steps that would have to be taken is that you're going to have to do a budget amendment, because now you're increasing the city's FTE count. So we will lay all of that out, Mayor and Commission. I think it would also be helpful if we put together, given that we've heard the direction that the board wants to go, we will put together a timeline that will spell out when the recruitment announcement would hit, what would be the closing date, what would be the period in terms of which we would evaluate the applications. We would at some point need to get direction from the board on whether you all want to interview the top 3, the top 5, what that number would be, and then how you want that process structured. So I would be in communication with you all on that, and then we'll flesh all that out, lay it all out so that everyone is clear how those next steps would roll out.
Okay, so the next steps is legal would look at the contracts between the interlocal, between the city, the CRA, come back to the board with suggestions for maybe amending that document and with provisions consistent with the consensus that we've reached today. From an administrative level, you'll work on putting together a timeline, going over that with the board members, and so they'll be clear. Does that make sense? Okay. Yes.
Beverly Malasa, Chief Internal Auditor. I do want to emphasize that I think we're all aware that we have an open audit related to CRA. So as you guys are making these decisions, I do want to emphasize one thing that we always notice in our audits is that we don't have policies or procedures that are being followed consistently. So I think it's important that whatever you decide, we establish whatever the policy or the procedure is going to be in advance, and then we follow through on it, versus if we say we're going to make a decision to bring someone in-house, and then later we determine what that policy or procedure would be. I think it would be putting the cart in front of the horse, so to speak, and it would be prudent to make sure we iron all of that out first before we begin a process that we don't have in place, written in place.
Okay, thank you. Not sure what that added, but anyway, okay. Any other questions, comments on this? Thank you all very much, and we will act accordingly.